Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Sir, you can start the session.
Okay, great, thank you. So, welcome everybody. Let's start today's session. We'll go over the law of, just pardon me, 1 second. Yeah. We're going to cover three key topics today, which is contract labor, uh, employment law associated with mergers and acquisitions, and the labor codes, right? So that's going to be on our agenda today, the final session for in this series. And again, I'd be happy to receive your questions towards the end. There are a few case studies that we'll be covering in today's session, which I would request your participation in. But any other questions that you may have, let's clarify all of those towards the end. So contract labor, right? Now, if you remember the first session, I had highlighted different types of engagement models in India, one of which is engaging as contract labor, where somebody is not on your payroll directly. It's a vendor is involved or a contractor is involved, like I said, a thekedar, as many people in North refer to, who hires these individuals and deploys them to work for a client's organization, right? Now, this is a prevalent system in a lot of industries, and very often it results in legal disputes and challenges. So, the Wistron incident in Bangalore, the Maruti Suzuki case, and there are many such other examples, right? Uh, so we'll need to understand what the legal framework around contract labor is on this session, right? And figure out what are the nuances that people need to bear in mind. Uh, Now, the contract labor regime is governed under the CLRA Act, or the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act from 1970. This law is applicable to every establishment employing 20 or more workmen as contract labor, and to every contractor who is supplying 20 or more workmen, right? Now, this 20 limit workmen can vary from one state to another. A lot of states have revised it to 50. Some have actually reduced it to 5, correct? Uh, so this is a state specific assessment that ultimately needs to be made. Now, the Contract Labor Act is not applicable fundamentally to organizations which are doing work of an intermittent or a casual nature, meaning which it's an industry which only operates for a few months in a year and is not like a permanent industry. The Contract Labor Act requires certain registrations and licenses to be obtained. The principal employer, or the PE, who is engaging 20 or more contract labor, has to obtain registration as a principal employer. The contractor, which supplies 20 or more laborers to a principal employer, also has to obtain a license. The contractor can only obtain a license on the back of a Form 5 that is issued by the principal employer to that contractor, right? Now, what are the key obligations under this law? So the contractor, as the actual employer of the individuals, has to ensure that there is compliance with the health and welfare obligations, right? So they have to provide things like canteens, restrooms, drinking water, first aid facilities to the staff who are deployed by that contractor to work for a particular client, right? The contractors are also obligated to ensure payment of wages, right, and ensure that at least minimum wages are being paid. Now, the principal employer, uh, there are certain obligations that are in the very first instance falling on the principal employer, right? So for example, under the Provident Fund Act or the Employee State Insurance Act, the principal employer actually has the primary obligation to make these payments, correct? And recover those from the contractor. Then there are certain obligations which, if the contractor were to fail to perform, then the principal employer will be required to provide this to extend those benefits. The principal employer under Section 21 is required to ensure timely payment of wages every month. The provision goes to the extent of saying that the principal employer's representative needs to be present while wages are being paid to the contract workers, right? Now, in today's day and age, that's not followed, with all kinds of online payment methods being implemented. But you should remember that this is a law from the 1970s. Now, you see, the law is called the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act. So what is the abolition angle to it, right? So what the law says is that the appropriate government can prohibit employment of contract labor in any process, operation, or other work, right? After taking into consideration certain factors. Now, these are typically factors such as whether the job is perennial in nature. Does that job typically mandate, or would you expect an organization to hire regular employees to do that job? Is it something which is core to an organization, right? It's a core function of the industry. What happens is the appropriate government, once it determines that certain industries or jobs in those industries are core in nature, it can pass a notification under Section 10 stipulating that contract labor cannot be hired in those jobs or industries. There is another approach to this. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, the law itself has been amended to say that contract labor cannot be hired in core activities, correct? So it's either a notification or an amendment to the law. Now, core activity is a very subjective term. What is core will really depend and vary from one organization to another. But essentially, it's an activity for which the organization is fundamentally set up, right? And its primary objectives that would typically fall in the ambit of core activity. So if I am a manufacturing setup, I'm making cards, then my assembly line where I'm putting those components together is a core function. There could be ancillary functions such as, for example, I have a big campus. I'm providing security on that campus. I'm dealing with some ancillary administrative issues like maintenance. Those types of things could be argued to be ancillary and not core activities of the establishment, right? Now, let's take a look at this case study. ABC India Limited, which is the client, has a contract with XYZ Limited, which is the vendor, for providing IT services. Now, under the contract, XYZ Limited is required to ensure that 65 of its employees are devoted to ABC's work. These employees are expected to continue to work from XYZ Limited's premises itself and not from ABC India's offices. So the people who are devoted to the work of ABC India are not working in ABC's offices, but they are continuing to work from the office of the vendor here. Now, my question to you is, will ABC India be required to take a registration as a principal employer? And will XYZ be limited to register as a contractor? Does anyone have any thoughts around this?
Yes, sir, they do have to register as the principal employer.
Mm-hmm.
And XYZ will also be required to register as a contractor because they are employing the contract workers, and XYZ Limited is the contractor in this case, and it's more than 20 contract workers.
But over here, these people are working in XYZ's own premises, right? So if you look at the definition of principal employer, it's defined as any person responsible for the supervision and control of the establishment. Is ABC under supervision and control of XYZ Limited's offices?
No, sir, not in this case.
Okay, so then does your answer change because of that?
So I think XYZ will still be required to register as a contract. I'm not so sure about ABC India.
Right, so the both of these obligations go hand in hand, right? What we see is that registration and license requirements typically only arise where the contractor is actually deploying its manpower or workforce to go and work in the establishment of the principal employer, because that's when the principal employer is sort of in control of that establishment, and instead of relying on its own employees, it's relying on the workers supplied by a third party agency. If in this example, like in the case of this example, the individuals who are providing services continue to work out of the establishment of their own employer, right, which is the vendor, then there's a very good argument to make that the Contract Labor Act would not apply at all. Then this would be like any other service agreement where XYZ Limited is essentially providing services to ABC using its own infrastructure, employees, and resources, correct? The answer would have been different if these 65 individuals were deputed to go and work in ABC's offices, right? And work in an establishment or premises over which ABC has control and not XYZ. So that's one important aspect to bear in mind. Now let's take a look at this example. Company X requires security guards. Instead of directly hiring security personnel, it chooses to employ guards through a contractor, Company Y. Now, Company Y is a fairly big company which provides thousands of security guards to organizations across the country. Company X, which is the principal employer here, has failed to make any kind of ESI and EPF contributions on behalf of the contract workers as is required by Indian law. As I mentioned on the earlier side, under PF and ESI laws, the primary obligation to pay these benefits falls on the principal employer, right? Now, Company X defends its actions by claiming that Company Y, being a large company, with Company Y is the vendor here, the vendor being a large company should be obligated to make these payments on its own under its own, registrations, independent registrations. Do you think Company X's defense will hold up in court?
Sharanya, please go ahead. Sharanya, you can go ahead.
My hand is not raised, but I think the answer is no. That.
Yeah, go on, please.
Yes, sir. I don't think that Company X can defend its actions because Company Y is the contractor on behalf of the contract workers, and that Company X should be made liable. If they are not able to pay, then Company Y will have to pay.
Okay. So see, a literal reading of the law, right, suggests that Company X has to pay first and it can recover from the contractor, because ultimately the contractor is hiring these people, right? But there is a Delhi High Court ruling which has actually supported the argument that Company X is making here, and said that if the contractor is a large company on its own, right, which has its own independent provident fund and ESI codes and registrations, then there's no reason why the contractor shouldn't be making payments for its own staff under these legislations, right? Now, if the contractor fails, then by all means, the principal employer, which is Company X, can be made responsible to pay. So in a sense, the courts have reversed the obligation and and sort of given some leeway to allow the principal employer to insist that the contractor makes these payments in the first instance, and the principal employer will only become liable if the contractor has failed. Now, this remains a bit of a gray area in the law. There are some cases where the courts have taken a very strict interpretation. But my experience with this has been, and we have sort of successfully defended this for clients also in proceedings under the PF Act, that if you can make sure that the contractors that you're working with are independently registered and complying with these laws, then as a matter of practice, you can insist that they pay these contributions, wages, etc. every month, provide you with the necessary documented proof of having complied. And on that basis, you can avoid a liability later on to say that, I, as the principal employer, should have paid this in the first instance. Now, what are the penalties for contravention? So, any contravention of the provisions, which includes not obtaining registrations or complying with the substantive provisions, can result in imprisonment up to 3 months or a fine. Continuing contraventions have an additional liability. Now, this is a law which has been significantly, how do I put it, criticized because of the fact that it's not really achieved the purpose that it had set out to achieve while it was enacted. It was meant to be a law to regulate and abolish contract labor. What it has effectively done is that it has given a sort of sanctity to the whole system, because once you've registered as a principal employer and you've registered as a contractor, it becomes difficult then for the contract workers to claim that they are employees of the principal employer. Now, we do see a lot of these claims arising, right? That's what was the problem at some level in Suzuki's plant in Haryana, where the contract workers were saying, you use us for permanent jobs on the assembly line, but we don't get any of the same benefits that your regular workers do, right? We're working the same number of hours. Why are we getting a raw deal, correct? Because of that, the contract labor very often try and file claims against the principal employer, arguing that they should not be treated as contract workers, but they should be treated as direct employees of the principal employer, right? And such claims have arisen on many occasions, and courts have sort of laid down principles around how they will be decided. Ultimately, if the entire arrangement with the contractor seems to be like a sham or a camouflage, right? I simply don't want these people on my head count. I therefore will engage some third party, call him a contractor, and hire people through him, correct? And that contractor is not really adding any value. He is just a sort of a paper entity engaged to hire these people, pay them their salaries, and do nothing else. Those types of arrangements can be sort of scrutinized by the courts, and if they believe that there are shams, then they can effectively pass orders to give the relief to workers to say that they should be absorbed by the principal employer as regular workers, right? So apart from the fact that the arrangement itself might be sham, they will also look at other factors such as who's really got the primary control and supervision on those contract workers, right? Now, if I'm an employer, I will typically have the right to make decisions such as terminate an employee, discipline an employee, change their terms and conditions of service, tweak their pay and benefits, etc. Now, if as a principal employer, I'm doing all of that, right, then that makes it a lot more easier for the contract workers to argue that they are effectively regular employees of the principal employer, right? Similarly, if the work is of a perennial nature where I'm hiring these people for long durations, and very often that's a big criteria that courts examine. How long has somebody acted as a contract worker for the particular client? And if you see that somebody has been acting as a contract worker in the same factory or establishment for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Then courts could very well argue that, it's a sort of a permanent perennial job. I don't see any reason why you should hire someone as a contract worker and not as your own employee, right? Other factors could be, what is the kind of integration between your employees and contract workers, right? Are they treated in exactly the same way as your employees for other reasons? For example, same uniforms, same access to facilities, canteens, transport. A lot of these things will then point to the fact that you are not really treating your contract workers. Your contract workers aren't really different from your regular employees. And these types of claims can therefore arise very often. And to any organization, therefore, engaging contract workers, you have to have a very well planned and nuanced policy and framework by which you engage contract workers. It could mean that you will only engage through reputed contractors. You will not exercise primary supervision and control. You might rotate the staff after a regular period, not keep people on for long durations. And most importantly, try and avoid hiring contract workers in core and perennial functions, correct? Now, the big question that very often gets asked is, why is the contract labor system so prevalent in India? I had hinted at this in our first session also, because of the fact that in India, there is very little flexibility when it comes to, employee separations. In factories with 100 or more or 300 or more workers, you need government permission to terminate a single worker, right? So people therefore resort to contract worker, their permanent worker headcount beyond that threshold. So if I need to run a factory with 150 workers in a state where I need permission from the government to terminate or close my factory, if I have more than 100 workers, then I will obviously keep my permanent worker headcount to only 99 or something like that, and hire the remaining 51 people as contract labor, correct? So that's one of the big reasons why the contract labor system is so prevalent in India. The other is, of course, cost arbitrage, right? Where employers will have to, because of the fact that there might be unions involved, there's collective bargaining involved, or other such reasons, they would typically have to extend benefits and pay to their regular employees, which often are much greater than what your typical contract worker gets, right? So by hiring people as contract workers, there can always be some cost savings also through the arbitrage model. The contractor will potentially just pay them minimum wages or little beyond that. They will not extend the same kind of benefits as the main client would, thereby making labor accessible at a cheaper cost, right? Also, there is a primary onus for compliance on the contractor under a lot of other statutes. So it makes it easier to pass on all those liabilities to the contractor, correct? So that's sort of an overview of the contract labor regime. I can pause here and answer any questions that you may have, and then move to the next portion of our session today. If no one has any questions, then we can just move forward.
Atul, we can move forward.
Sure. So let's move on to the next topic, which is employee transfers during the M&A transactions and otherwise, right? Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Section 25FF of the Industrial Disputes Act. In a lot of countries, there are very sophisticated rules around how employees have to be dealt with in case a business is being bought, right, or sold. what are the employees' rights, or even for that matter, when certain functions or activities in a particular business is being outsourced. So what are the employees' rights? Do they have the right to insist that they continue to be employed by the new employer or the acquirer of that business? Do they have the right to insist that if some functions are being outsourced to a third party service provider, that the third party service provider hire those same people, right? Are they entitled to any kind of specific compensation? So in a lot of jurisdictions, there are special rules around this. In Europe, there are the acquired right directives. In UK, there are the transfer of undertaking regulations known as the TUPE regulations, right? In India, unfortunately, there isn't any such sophisticated framework. There is only one section, which is Section 25FF of the Industrial Disputes Act, which in a way deals with business sales transfers and M&A transactions, right? Now, what typically ends up happening in Indian deals where there is, let's say, a movement of employees from one legal entity to another because of a transaction, you would either terminate the employees and pay them their severance pay, or you would transfer their employment to the acquiring entity, right? And let's deal with the transfer of processes and how those can be carried out, and how what Section 25FF does around that today. Now, bear in mind, as I said, there is no mandatory obligation under Indian law that where there is some sort of an M&A transaction or a business transfer where the assets and employees, the assets or the business of one company is being purchased by another. There's no mandatory obligation that the buyer has to hire all the employees too. Correct. But there could be tax reasons why they might want to do that. I don't want to get into that right now. But suffice to say that there is no legal mandate which obligates, unlike in Europe or in UK, there's no legal mandate which obligates the purchaser to offer or extend employment to all employees of the selling entity, right? That makes their position a little bit more precarious in India. Now, assuming that a buyer wants to actually assume or acquire the business along with its employees and doesn't want to get rid of the employees, right? Now, what are the options to do that? Now, Section 25FF talks about a situation where in case of transfer of ownership, right, of the management or ownership of the transfer of ownership or the management of an undertaking, either by contract or by statute, every workman who has been in continuous service of that undertaking, which is the target undertaking, for at least 1 year, is entitled to notice and compensation as if he were being retrenched. So those are the elements of Section 25FF. There has to be a transfer of ownership or management of an entire undertaking. Every workman alone, someone who can be classified as a workman. If you go back to our first session, we discussed the rules around who is a workman, who's not, right? So every workman who's been in continuous service of that undertaking for at least 1 year will be entitled to notice and compensation as if he were being retrenched. So this is sort of creating a legal fiction to say that every time there is a business transfer, all workmen will be entitled to notice and compensation, sort of assuming that they will lose their jobs, correct? But it doesn't say that they will, it's as though they were losing their jobs. But there is an exception to this. There is a proviso which says that the obligation to pay notice and compensation will not apply if these three tests are met. The transfer of the business does not interrupt their service. The terms and conditions of service that are being offered to them by the purchaser of that business, right, are not any less favorable to the workmen compared to what they enjoyed with the seller. And the new employer or the buyer is legally obligated and undertakes to pay them retrenchment compensation on the basis that the service has been continuous. So what essentially this section is doing is it's creating a framework where workmen are assured of compensation and notice in the event the buyer is not willing to hire them or if the buyer is trying to hire them in a manner whereby there is a disruption in their service, right? And they are not getting the same terms of service, right? And effectively there is a break in their tenure. So this is the limited framework that Indian law has to stipulate when it comes to business corporate transactions involving legal entities, right? Now, what does that mean in the practical sense? Now, let's take a look at this case study. Now, ABC Inc. acquired the entire share capital of XYZ in October in an overseas transaction, right? So these are two US based companies which where the target, which is XYZ, was acquired by ABC. Now, it's a share acquisition. So, XYZ effectively became a ABC group company. Now, ABC India and XYZ India, these are the Indian subsidiaries of the respective US parent entities, continue to operate as separate entities in legal entities in India, right? Even after the acquisition has occurred. They are now commonly owned because of the share acquisition, but they operate as separate legal entities. Now, ABC, which is the acquirer, is considering formally shifting all employees and assets from XYZ India to ABC India and winding up XYZ India, right? Obviously, it doesn't want to operate two legal entities as the owner. So it's consolidating its operations. It wants to consolidate its operations into one entity. Now, in this context, ABC wants to understand the procedure to carry out a compliant transfer of employees from XYZ India to ABC India, right? XYZ India, bear in mind that XYZ India has both workmen and non-workmen as part of its workforce. And XYZ India also has a trade union, correct? So what approach can be taken to transfer the employees? Should it be consent based or non-consent based? And remember, these are the rules where there is a transfer of ownership of a management or the ownership of an undertaking. All workmen who work there for at least 1 year will be entitled to notice and compensation unless these conditions are stated to be met, right? So over here, if XYZ is essentially going to transfer its assets and employees to ABC, and let's assume that ABC is willing to hire all the employees, right? What is the approach it should be taking? And the second question, which I haven't explained to you, but I would like to hear your thoughts on, do you think consent of the workers would be required, or the union would be required here before the employees of XYZ can be moved to ABC? Do you have any thoughts around this? Any volunteers with any ideas? Okay. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail, right? Now there are two approaches to doing this. XYZ could either take consent of its workers and tell them that, we are now owned by ABC. So we are going to move you all from XYZ into ABC, correct? I'm coming to you for consent. So please agree to transfer over to the new legal entity, correct? Now, in some cases, Indian courts have taken a view that if the conditions of Section 25FF are satisfied, right, then consent may not be required, correct? So these are the conditions that I talked about, which means that there is no interruption in their service. The terms and conditions of service that are applicable to them after the transfer are not any less favorable. And the buying entity or the acquiring entity recognizes their service to pay future retrenchment compensation, right? So if they don't want to take a consent approach here, and they want to move everyone from XYZ to ABC without having to deal with the hassle of negotiating with the trade union or each workman, then they will need to ensure that the conditions of Section 25FF are satisfied, right? Some courts have actually gone to say that if these conditions are satisfied, it would amount to what is known as a statutory transfer, and there can be an automatic transfer of their employment, right, without needing to speak with each worker or their unions, right? The flip side to this approach is you have to ensure that these conditions under Section 25FF are met, meaning which ABC and XYZ will need to do a thorough assessment to ensure that the terms and conditions offered by ABC are no less favorable than what the workmen were enjoying with XYZ, right? And that there is no break in their service, which means that whatever settlements, agreements, etc. might have existed between the union at XYZ and that entity will have to be assumed as is and complied with by ABC. The other approach that could be considered here is you obtain consent of the workers and the unions, right? Because there is some conflicting jurisprudence around whether or not consent is required under Section 25FF. There is a possibility that if you take the without consent approach, the workmen or their unions could raise a dispute saying that we do not agree, we do not want to move to ABC, in the past, because they have variety of apprehensions around what their employment future will be like with the acquiring entity, right? Very often they will have apprehensions that their terms will be changed. They will have apprehensions that they might be terminated. They will have apprehensions that they might be relocated or transferred to another location, correct? So they have all kinds of apprehensions because of which they attempt to block these deals, right? So if you take a with consent approach, you might avoid those kinds of disputes. But the problem also is that you will then have to negotiate with the workers and their unions, right? Which can then hold you to, who can then sometimes hold you to ransom and say that, I will not agree or consent to the transfer unless my demands are met, or, we are given a certain increment or assurances, correct? The with consent approach will also come with one other benefit apart from ensuring that there aren't any disputes, which is ABC as the acquiring entity may have some flexibility, right, to make some changes to their terms and conditions, right? So when I'm going and explicitly seeking consent from the workers or the unions, I could say that, okay, I'm willing to hire you, right? I want you to give your consent, but I will not follow exactly the same terms and conditions that you had in XYZ. I have certain different policies, right? So these terms will apply and I will somehow make it up with you in some other manner, right? So a consent-based approach gives you some more flexibility to align your terms and conditions, with those that existed in the acquiring entity already. Now, in my experience, where there are trade unions engaged, right, and the overall relationship with the trade union is a difficult one, right? Then we've actually seen organizations take the without consent approach because they would rather move the employees over to the acquiring entity and deal with any objections that they have afterwards, rather than potentially approach them to start negotiating and consulting with them and therefore delay the transaction, right? So I've seen the without consent approach being taken in pure play manufacturing setups with a lot of unions, which might be aggressive. It comes with the cost of lack of flexibility. You just have to continue to follow their existing terms and conditions. You can't change them or tweak them, but it ensures that the deal at least goes through. The consent-based approach is more common to see in other types of industries such as the IT sector or the knowledge-based industry, service industries, where you're typically not dealing with trade unions and you're dealing with more educated, sophisticated, so-called white-collar jobs, right, and employees, where they would be more understanding of the transactions, and so long as they see that their jobs are secure, they are willing to, grant consent. Now, I talked about how there are conflicting rulings of the Supreme Court on consent. This proves to be a big issue in most transactions even today, where organizations are forced to take aggressive views and legal opinions on what's the best approach to take, right, in the manner that I just described in our previous case study. So there is an older Mettur-Beardsell Supreme Court ruling which actually says that there is nothing in the wording of Section 25 FF that even remotely suggests that consent is a prerequisite to transfer the workers, right? However, there is a later Supreme Court ruling which I believe at some level is per incurium, which simply says quite blankly, without referring back to older precedents, to say that it's settled law that without consent workmen cannot be transferred to a different entity and management, right? So there is some ambiguity, but I would take a view that so long as the elements of Section 25 FF can be shown to legitimately exist, there might be a good case to argue that consent is not necessary. Right? Whether you choose to take that approach or not is really going to be very case and transaction specific. Right? So that also brings me to an end on the M&A portion of today's session. Anyone has any questions up until now? Has any of you ever researched or analyzed this issue before? So that's fine. I understand at your level, it's unlikely that many of you would have dealt with this, but what I just talked about tends to be a very significant portion of the work that gets done in corporate firms, right? And as part of the employment practice, because big deals, multi-million but billion-dollar deals, all have a very, very significant employment law component. And the decisions around how you're going to hire employees, what terms and conditions you want to extend to them, do I need to negotiate with them, seek their consent? All of these can be very, very material considerations to work through when you are doing large scale transactions, right? And if you search, you will actually find many instances where workers and their rights have played a huge role in the success or failure of these transactions. So this is actually a very, very big and important element of employment law practice today. Let's move on to the final leg of our session today on the new labor codes, right? And what are the key changes that are being introduced by the government? Now, the labor codes have been in the works for many, many years. It's not something that was conceptualized and implemented in just 1 or 2 years. It's been in the making for a better part of this decade, and in fact, right, with recommendations from the National Commission of Labour going back many years to consolidate labor laws, right? There are many reasons for that. One is our laws are old, archaic, complex, very, very procedure driven, and very often inconsistent as well, right? They are also not very business friendly, as we discussed earlier. So the objective was to try and make the regime a bit more sort of consolidated and easy to follow, and in the process try and make it more business friendly as well. Now, the labor codes are out. they've been notified, they've been passed by the parliaments, they're waiting to be notified into law. It's anticipated that that's going to happen anytime after April this year, in the new financial year. But, the judgment is out as to whether or not they've actually achieved the objectives that they were set out, that were elucidated at the time that they were conceptualized, right? In some aspects, I would say yes, right? There has been some eliminations of overlaps. There has been some eases around how you can, comply. Not everything has to be physical applications. A lot of it has moved online. There's been some rationalization of criminal liabilities and penalties around it, right? So that not every trivial non-compliance will threaten you with imprisonment, right? But at the same time, I think they have also failed in many respects. If you closely scrutinize these laws, they are very often just a sort of a amalgamation or a copy paste of a lot of the old legislation, and not too many substantive changes have occurred, right? So the old rules which I criticize, such as prior permission to go and take prior permission of the government to go and terminate a single worker in a factory, right? Those types of rules have continued to remain, correct? But I certainly think it's a positive step forward. It does revise the regime in many good ways, right? So let's look at what the four codes are trying to achieve, right? The key highlights of the four codes. The code on wages was in fact passed in 2019 itself. It consolidates the laws relating to minimum wages, payment of wages, statutory bonus, and equal remuneration, right? The Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, or the OSH code as typically referred to, consolidates about 13 different legislation, right? The Factories Act, Contract Labor Act, Interstate Migrant Workers Act, Building and Construction Workers Act, Mines Act, Dock Workers Act, Plantation Labor Act, Working Journalists Act, Motor Transport Workers Act, Sales Promotion Employees Act, BD and Cigar Workers, Cine Workers, Cinema Theatre Workers, right? So if you remember our first session, I talked about how there are 150 plus, 200 plus laws in India. That's because of the fact that each and every sector seems to have its own unique legislation. So now this code is trying to sort of consolidate all these legislations into one common occupational safety, health and working conditions code, whose focus is really, as the name suggests, health, safety and working conditions. The Industrial Relations Code is consolidating three key legislations, which is the Industrial Disputes Act, the Trade Unions Act, and the Standing Orders Act, right? The Code on Social Security consolidates 9 legislations relating to social security payments and benefits, such as the Maternity Benefit Act, the Employee State Insurance Act, Provident Fund Act, Gratuity Act, Employees Compensation Act, etc. Right? So now that's sort of what it's doing. So 40 plus 34 odd legislations have now been clubbed into and to some extent rationalized into 4 codes. Now, one of the key highlights of these codes is a common definition of wages. Currently, each and every statute has its own definition as to what amounts to wages, right? So Provident Fund talks about the term basic wages, right? It has its own interpretation as to what amounts to basic wages. Gratuity Act defines wages, which is again limited. It's nowhere as wide as the Provident Fund Act. It only includes some components of salary, such as basic salary and the earner's allowance. The Employee State Insurance Act has its own definition. The Employees Compensation Act has its own definitions, right? So there are different definitions under multiple laws today, which creates compliance hurdles for all organizations, right? What the labor codes, and not just the wage code, practically all labor codes have now chosen to comply with one common definition of wages, and which is going to be applied for all purposes under the law, whether it's for payment of salaries, whether it's for payment of statutory benefits, whether it's for payment of end of service payments and compensations, right? So that's a big benefit to the industry because it makes compliance a lot more streamlined. Having said that, it's also creating a lot of complications because they've tried to use a one size fit all formula, right? And sometimes that does create a lot of absurd outcomes and conundrums, which could have been avoided if there were in some instances, definitions which are more fit for the purpose and more fit for the particular legislation in question, right? I personally don't agree with the kind of approach that has been taken in the labor codes. Even if you see the new definition of wages, it's effectively a copy paste of the old definitions, right? They haven't really applied too much more thinking to it. It's pretty much very similar to what existed in the Payment of Wages Act, and the other legislations they've sort of ignored and made few tweaks here and there. I think it ignores how currently wages are structured in most organizations, where there are certain components which are fixed and guaranteed. There are certain which are variable, discretionary or conditional in nature. And there are some which are over and above all of that, right? Soft perks, benefits. Simply taking that approach would have been a lot more simpler, right? Rather than using, in fact, verbiage and language from laws which go back 50, 70, 80 years, right? If not more. So it's a consolidated exercise. It's making things a bit more streamlined, but probably not the most ideal, right? Sorry, just give me one moment. Yeah, thanks. I'm back, and is the presentation visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So I think the approach they've taken, while the purpose is laudable, the objective that they were trying to achieve is laudable. It's failed to a great extent in my mind in the implementation, right? Currently, we are working with multiple organizations and clients, helping them take stock of their pay practices, their pay and compensation philosophies, and trying to see whether they align with the codes and whether any changes are required, or any tweaks or revisions are required, right? All organizations want to obviously keep their employees happy, but at the same time avoid incurring incremental costs where they can be avoided. So the wage code, right? One of the big changes, and I think this is a very good and relevant, important change, is there is now going to be a concept of a national floor wage. The current law on minimum wages is very, very state specific, right? It's a central law, but what it essentially allows every appropriate government to do and every state government to do is come up with minimum wages for various scheduled industries. So as I was mentioning earlier, under the Minimum Wage Act, in each state you will find that there is a list of 30, 40, 50 scheduled industries, commercial establishments, factories, plastic industry, textile industry, multiple different industries. For each of those industries, there will be separate minimum wages prescribed, keeping in mind further subcategories such as which area of the city is the industry in, what are the skill level or the types of jobs carried out by the employees. So it's a highly complicated and complex, convoluted process. and it doesn't even in fact cover everyone, right? Because if you're not working in a scheduled industry, then that minimum wage law has no application on you. So now what the government is proposing is a floor wage, a national level floor wage. It's not yet been prescribed, so we don't know what that is going to be, right? But a national level floor wage, and then giving some autonomy to the state governments to prescribe minimum wages, which has to be at least equal to or more than the floor wage, correct? So it cannot go below it. Now, the law is written up because of pushback from state governments, etc., with some exceptions. So there could be variations based on geographical necessities, right? The criticism was that why do I pay someone in Bombay the same minimum wage as someone in a tier 3 city, right? Where the cost of living is much cheaper, correct? So there could be some tweaks that we will see, state specific or region specific variations to this. But on the whole, the idea is that you're going to set a sort of floor and organize, and states will be expected to follow it, correct? I think that offers a huge benefit to the growth of our country and economy, because then industry can expand, right? Currently, what do we see? We see people moving from small villages, cities to urban centers simply because of better wage opportunities, correct? But if these is implemented as intended, and they can be assured of a certain minimum wage which is aligned throughout the country, even in their tier 2, tier 3 city, correct? Then it will actually act as an incentive for industry to set up operations in those areas, right? And for people and talent to remain there and work in those industries as well, correct? They don't have to then run to urban centers to find higher wages, right? Industries will also have the ability to rely on cheaper real estate and infrastructure to set up industries in outside of the big industrial belts alone, right? So it will, in a sense, decentralize the development of our economy and industrialization. And I think it will take away pressure from big urban centers like Mumbai, Gurgaon, Bangalore, Hyderabad. All of these are now becoming concentrations where everyone is rushing to find work and jobs. Now, potentially, if implemented nicely, it will create the ability for jobs to be available at good rates and good wages across the country, right? So I think that's a very progressive change. The next change is the law on equal remuneration has been made gender neutral. Currently, it only protects women, right? It's now being made gender neutral, which is again a positive step. So the focus is now on actual skills, experience, etc., and not on what the gender is. So long as there are equally paced individuals, right? Same type of qualification, same type of job and experience, they ought to be paid equally, irrespective of what gender they belong to. The other change that is being brought about is there is now more express recognition of fixed term employment. Fixed term employment has existed as a concept historically too. It's not something new, honestly, but through more express recognition, it's going to potentially become a little bit more mainstream. And this can give industries the long wanted flexibility that they've been hoping for, right, in many instances. So now if they have project driven jobs, right, which are only for a fixed tenure, you don't necessarily need to hire people as permanent employees and then deal with the headache of trying to make them redundant or terminating them, seeking permission or complying with other rules. Sorry, was someone saying something? So the Industrial Relation Code is now explicitly recognizing the concept of FTEs and allowing organizations a freer hand to go ahead and hire people as contract as fixed term employees. However, it comes with certain safeguards, right? So if you have people in fixed term jobs doing similar tasks, they might be project driven, but similar to what permanent employees are doing, then their wages and benefits can't be any lesser. Plus, even if I'm a fixed term employee, I will get pro rata access to benefits like gratuity. I don't need to necessarily work for the full 5 years to be entitled to these benefits, right? So it's going to make it easier for industry to hire, and it won't be detrimental even for employees to take up fixed term jobs, correct? They might in fact welcome it. Another key change, and this can be a significant area of disputes and problems in the industry, which is recognition of trade unions, right? Currently, the Trade Union Act only provides for registration of trade unions in India, right? Meaning which, if I have certain people, 7 people and office bearers, etc., I can go and register myself as a registered trade union. Just because I'm a registered trade union doesn't make me a recognized union where there is a ability for me to act as the sole bargaining agent, right? And negotiate with my employer. So you could have a situation where in an industry there are multiple registered unions, right? I have 1,000 employees. There is one union which says I have 200 employees as my members. There's one union which says I have 300 employees as my members. There's one union which says I have 400 employees as my members, right? Each union wants to negotiate and bargain with the establishment on its own. How do I know which one to bargain with, right? There is a code of conduct, which is sort of a non-binding code that the industry itself formulated many years ago, which sort of laid down some guidelines as to how you could then recognize and bargain with these unions. But it was felt that there is need for formal statutory recognition of or implementation of union recognition rules. So they do exist in some states. So there is Maharashtra, which has the MRTU and pulp law, which lays down a framework by which unions can apply to an industrial court for recognition, right? So if they represent at least 30% of the workmen in an establishment, then they can make an application to the industrial court and seek a ruling from the court whereby they are tagged or given the designation of the recognized union, right? But these laws don't exist throughout the country. Very few states have such laws. So constantly we find there is politics, disputes involved between unions, between the union and the management, between the unions themselves on who should be recognized and who should have authority to bargain with the management. The IR code is changing all of that. It is now formally introducing concepts of union recognition, and it is saying that every employer has to mandatorily recognize a registered union if it represents more than 51% of the workers in its payroll as the sole negotiating union of workers. But this is in the case where there are multiple trade unions, right? If there is only one registered trade union, then it automatically becomes the sole negotiating union. If there are multiple trade unions, registered trade unions, then the one that represents 51% of the or more has to be recognized as the sole negotiating union. If you have multiple trade unions, none of which have 51% worker representation, right? Then all those unions which at least represent 20% of the workers can come together and form a negotiating council. Right? So now this is what the new law is mandating in terms of union recognition rules. I think it's a positive step. It gives clarity to organizations as to whom they should be dealing with. I think the only flaw in this is that they haven't stipulated a threshold, a worker representation threshold, if there is only one registered union, right? So I could potentially be a sole negotiating union merely because I am the only union that exists, even though my membership might be as little as 15-20% of the workers in an establishment, right? That doesn't sort of seem to make any sense. They should have put some minimum worker threshold or membership threshold to become even a sole negotiating union. But it's certainly a very positive move. It does create a lot more clarity on how to deal with trade unions. Now, we spent the initial part of our session today dealing with contract workers, right? And how contract labor system is regulated by the CLRA Act of 1970. Now, this law is also being revised. One of the biggest criticisms that that existed was, you want to apply contract labor to pure manpower supply arrangements, right? Where the vendor is not providing any service other than hiring people and deploying them to work for a client, right? Those types of arrangements you can still treat as contract labor. But there could be other arrangements where the vendor is not merely hiring people and deploying them. It's actually providing a service in its own right? So the vendor has its own specialization. It's got its own skills. What it's offering to you is a service or a solution. And as part of that, it might have to send its employees to come and work for me in my establishment, right? Now, the mere fact that it is deploying its employees to work in the client's establishment would, in the current regime, cover it under the Contract Labor Act, correct? Now, this was heavily criticized. And in some industries, it's very, very common fare. So big IT companies will render services to each other, and very often they will deploy its manpower to the other client. But they are established IT companies in their own right. They're not like contractors, right? Just supplying headcount. So what the law is now doing is it's revising the definition to exclude workers who are sort of regularly employed in the vendor's establishment, right? And who are periodically given increments. They have clearly established terms and conditions of service. They have access to social security, welfare benefits, etc., which is typically what you would find in service agreements. So it's effectively revising the definition to reduce the types of arrangements which would be treated as contract labor arrangements. It's, however, also expanding it to include specifically interstate migrant workers. Many of you would be familiar with who they are, which is, essentially workers working in a particular location, but they belong to a different state, correct? So this is a positive change. But at the same time, there has been a definitional change, or there has been an approach change on the contract labor being completely prohibited from the very beginning in core activities, right? So previously, as I mentioned, there had to be either an amendment to the law like Andhra Pradesh did, or a notification from the government saying that we are going to prohibit contract labor in certain activities. Now the new code is fundamentally prohibiting contract workers in core activities, and it's only allowing engagement of contract workers in ancillary activities and functions. There could be exceptions to this rule, where let's say the activity is ordinarily done, it's a core activity, but it is ordinarily done through a contractor, right? So where through decades of prior practice, certain activities are only done through contractors and not through regular employees, right? Or where you can argue that the activities don't really require full-time workers for most part of the day, or where there are sudden variations in demand, right? So let's say a textile industry, typically I manufacture 10,000 shirts a month. I have a sudden demand to manufacture 20,000 in the next 1 month, right? So I need to necessarily hire and augment my headcount. So even though it's a core function, I might be able to go ahead and engage a contract worker for it, right? So now that's something that organizations will have to be mindful of because of the fundamental restriction on hiring in core activities. A lot of the industries will now need to take a look back at their current practices and figure out whether or not they can continue to engage people as contract workers. The interstate migrant workers definition has also been revised. This came into the limelight because of all the migrations that we saw during the pandemic. A lot of the workers were left without any sort of security on their jobs, any sort of access to food or shelter, so on and so forth, right? So the definition of interstate migrant workers has been expanded. It's covering anyone earning less than 18,000 a month who is either directly recruited by the employer or indirectly recruited through a vendor from one state to work in another state, right? It even includes people who come on their own, right? Without any invitation from any particular employer, but they come on their own to go and work in another state, right? And in these types of situations, both the employer and the vendor will be obligated to provide various benefits to the workers, ensure suitable conditions of work, and make annual payments to them to allow them to go and come back from their home states, right? So it's sort of creating a slightly more protectionist regime around the most vulnerable workers, which are the interstate migrant workers. So sorry, I missed raising this earlier. So what are the exclusions from what is the core activity, right? So these are the expressly recognized exclusions. So sanitation work, sweeping, cleaning, dusting, security, canteen, loading, unloading, running of ancillary things like hospitals, education, training institutes, etc. So it's not as though a hospital by itself is excluded or training and education institutions are excluded. And it's not as though none of the activities there are core. If it's more in the context of a situation where, let's say, I am a big industry, I run a hospital or a dispensary for my workers right in the campus, or I run an educational institute for my workers on my campus. Now, those types of functions are then ancillary to my core activity, and those are then treated as exceptions to the core rule. So, this is a fairly long list, and anything out of these, and it's a very subjective assessment. If it is a core activity, then you ought not to be hiring contract workers in that. There are other changes in the OSHW code. Currently, a lot of states require organizations to take prior permission before they can hire women in the night shift or during nighttime hours. Now the code is permitting women to work beyond 7 o'clock. There's no permission requirement per se, provided there are certain conditions that are abided by in terms of their safety, security, etc. Right? There are progressive provisions to accommodate health and safety welfare measures for transgenders. There are lots of new duties that have been imposed on organizations. While factories had a lot of health and safety obligations, your typical offices and commercial buildings had very limited obligations. The OSHW code is trying to make provision for something more systemic. So all organizations have to ensure that the workplace is free from hazards. They have to do annual health checkups that are free on a free of cost basis. They have to ensure proper disposal of hazardous and toxic waste. Everyone has to be given an appointment letter, right? So that their terms and conditions are clearly documented. There are other ease of business type of provisions, like you can now do electronic filings, maintain records in an electronic form. The fines and the penalties have been made. The penalty provisions have been revised. So what they have done is they've increased the fines a lot, but at the same time they've sort of taken away the risk of imprisonment. Correct. So it's avoiding jail time, but at the same time it's penalizing you monetarily in case you don't abide by the law. So sort of this is an overview of all the changes that we've seen in that we're seeing in the labor code. It's a matter of as maybe few weeks or a few months at best where these codes will now become law, and organizations will have to align their practices to it. So, for anyone who is doing labor law, who has studied these multiple Bayer Acts for the last many years, there is now going to be a bit of a relearning process. So for any of you who's interested in researching any issue under the current legal regime, you should also necessarily pick up the new law, the new codes, and see whether the position is going to change, whether interpretations might vary, whether old judgments and case laws will continue to have the same meaning because the law has now changed, right? So it's a pretty significant development. We haven't seen this kind of changes in many decades, and I don't anticipate it will occur again in many more decades. So it's important that everyone familiarizes themselves with the new codes. So that sort of ends both our session today as well as the overall series. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Do let me know. Yeah, hi, Dr. Risam.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Apple. We have seen formation of these codes as a consolidation of the various laws. But don't you think leaving certain things at the end of the states to do it as per their convenience and requirements will sooner or later again dilute the purpose of consolidation of these laws, and multiplicity of laws will emerge in years to come?
Yeah, I think so, because see, and I don't think that's avoidable. I don't think that's avoidable. See, because it's a concurrent list subject, both the state and the central government continue to have the right to legislate. So I do anticipate that there will continue to be multiplicity of laws. State governments will continue to have their own set of rules, plus their own local legislations. I don't know what the fix to that is, honestly. The government, the central government, is trying to push the state governments to come up with rules and laws and which are aligned with the center's position on it. So if you see one of the most important state laws, which is the Shops Act, right? That is not being consolidated at all. So each state will continue to have its own separate Shops and Commercial Establishments Act, with different leave entitlements, different entitlements for working hours, overtime limits, etc. Now, how does an organization deal with that, right? That's a very significant aspect of compliance for them. So those issues are remaining unanswered until and unless all states also sort of come up with a uniform Shops Act, right? And the central government has attempted that. It came out with a model Shops Act and basically circulated to every state government, said we would appreciate it if you can align your state Shops Act with this model Shops Act which the center has come up with, right? Some states have tried to make some changes, some haven't, correct? But yeah, I mean, till the time it's a concurrent subject, there is very little that we can do to ensure that this multiplicity goes away. Organizations will be required to deal with both central and state rules and laws for the foreseeable future.
Moreover, one more thing I would like to add here. Don't you feel somewhere again the upper hand will always be in the hand of corporates and industrialists? Because to please them, definitely governments will always have a bent towards them instead of the labor and the working class.
So the government obviously is under pressure from both sides, right? The industry wants flexibility and freedom to do business. They don't want to be caught up in red tape and disputes. The workers want protection, correct? It's a difficult balancing act. I think the codes have tried to achieve some sort of balance here. The trade unions, if you pick up the newspapers, are still protesting against the implementation of these codes. They believe that adequate consultations have not occurred, etc. But they continue to also benefit from a lot of provisions which are very, very protectionist in nature, right? Because there is absolutely no relaxation of rules which require the industry to seek prior government permission to terminate. I haven't seen such rules in practically any other developed or developing country. So, there's been a bit of a balancing act. I won't say that workers have a raw deal here. They continue to have a lot of protective provisions. At the same time, the industry is being given some amount of flexibility to run its business in a manner which is most conducive to it. I mean, in fact, if you look at things, the compensation payable to workers is going up. There is now a reskilling fund that has been established. Organizations are now going to be required to set up grievance redressal committees, which will require mandatory worker representation, right? Any establishment with 20 or more workers will have to set up a grievance redressal committee. So there are changes which are actually making things easier for workers. And in fact, adding to organizations' compliance and management burden. So I mean, I won't pass judgment to say that it continues to be favoring the industry. I think it's trying to achieve some balance somewhere, and I, in fact, personally think that it's still quite pro-employee.
But the way we saw the things moving out post lockdown, we saw how the states immediately dismissed the rights and certain acts in some of the states. They were inviting industrialists to start up the work. That was one situation which clearly shows that wherever the axe will fall, it will always fall on the employee.
No, you're right. And I think some of those moves were very, very poorly thought through. So, the Uttar Pradesh government tried to pass an ordinance saying that practically all labor laws are suspended, right? Now, mind you, they've been pulled back. They've been challenged in courts. So many of them have been pulled back, right? And I think those are aberrations. Those weren't really meant to be long-standing or permanent features. That was more of poorly thought reactions to multiple months of inactivity and economic loss. Correct. So I don't think the idea is to dilute workers' rights to an extent where they have no incentive left to work, right? Or they can be made to work without any limits on hours or pay and things like that. I don't think that's what the codes are also achieving. So I want to use those as examples to say that this is the direction in which labor laws in India are moving permanently. The labor codes in that sense have tried to achieve balances where workers' rights are also being protected. And we need to bear in mind that, we might call ourselves a socialist republic, but for all intents and purposes, we are a very capitalist economy.
I wanted to end my thought with this particular view only, that in years to come will surely be becoming a capitalist economy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We are.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, I had a question like I am very clear with the things that we have studied so far, but I have a question like a more of a practical, like as an intern, right? So since 3 days we all are discussing these employment laws and everything, and it is very nice and new thing for us to know. But I was just researching that how one should get into these working areas. Like how should one procure the internships and what type of internships? Like which companies should one people for the beginning go to? Like if I talk about Trilegal, these all are tier one companies. So they will I don't will they be able to make us understand the key nuances or not? Like what is your perspective in that regard?
Will they be able to make you understand? Sorry, I didn't follow.
So basically, I am for instance, I am a second year learner, and after this 3-day course, I am really interested to work in this area of law. Now, how can I procure an internship in this department at any law firm? Like, what should be the prerequisites that I should keep in mind before applying for it, or what are the things that can help me get a easy internship opportunity?
So see, there's no shortcuts to anything. Every area of law requires study, right? As interns, you need to have an open mind. The first and foremost thing is an interest, right? The more you are interested in something, the more you'll read about a particular subject, right? So read a lot more about this. Once you work in firms which do employment work, you will get the ability and opportunity to fine tune and hone your skills, right? Do further research and develop.
Right, I understand your point, but what I really want to know how one should start in this. Like for the beginning opportunity, how should one like procure that? Like if I tell you that okay, I start reading, and now I want to intern at a place where these where employment laws are there. So how should I go about it? Like where should I find these internships?
So you should look at all the big firms in India, big and small firms. I think now employment law is a department which every firm has in some size. It might not be very big. It might not be standalone or exclusive, but all firms are doing employment law. If you, in fact, write to them saying, listen, I'm interested in interning in this area. In fact, that might be attractive to those firms, because if a firm is developing an employment law practice and they find that there are candidates who are actually interested in that subject, then they might be willing to give them that opportunity to learn, right? But once you have an internship, don't go in with the mindset that that somebody is going to sit down and coach you or teach you. The bulk of the burden in internships, and that's what differentiates a good intern from a bad intern, is what effort you put, right? What effort you put in researching a subject. I do not like interns who come up to you where you call them and give them a problem and then they ask you for solutions. So sir, where do I look? So sir, what should be the answer? That's not what, if I had to do that, then I wouldn't even call you to give you a problem, right? So you need to be able to demonstrate that you are interested and you are willing to research. As regards your first step of hurdle of trying to get an internship, look at variety of websites which rank employment law practices in the country. You will find all kinds of names of practices there. The biggest firms to the mid-size to the small firms, correct? Look at Chambers, look at Legal 500, look at many such other areas where there is a list of practices which do employment law. Use your college's resources, use your personal resources to apply to those departments. Make it clear that, listen, I'm interested in this field, correct? That might make it easier for you to get a placement. Try with the smaller firms first, right? Go up the ladder. A lot of the big firms will typically not even get interns who are in a second year. For example, Trilegal will probably not take interns below the 4th, 5th year in any event, right? Sometimes 3rd years. So you need to work through this. There's no single, solution to it, but certainly draw up a list of all the firms who do employment law. Do not hesitate in applying. Only if you apply, you will get. It doesn't matter if you're rejected. Make it clear that you're interested in that subject area. Try and see if you can write something, right? Pick up a topic. do some research, write about it, publish it if you can. There are lots of websites who allow students to publish stuff. The moment you demonstrate that I'm actually interested, I've actually done research, published something, and this is my area of interest. And when you apply to firm saying with all that evidence to say that, can I get a position in your employment law team to intern, your chances improve significantly.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the feedback.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, I wanted to ask that how is like the relation between labor law and entertainment industry? If I want to study about that, what would be the best place? Like, is there a particular book or like any particular source I should refer to?
Your question was a bit muffled. The entertainment law and employment law. Sorry, what do you want to know?
No,
What?
sir, the application of labor laws in entertainment industry.
Right.
Yeah, sir. I want to know more about particularly that area. So, is there a particular source I should?
I don't know of any offhand source, honestly. The entertainment industry, cine workers and artists have found special place in the labor codes. Firstly, read that, right? That itself will give you a better sense of what types of special rules apply to workers in that industry. And sometimes, these industries are driven by practices. So, for example, it's very, very common to see independent consultants or contractors in the entertainment industry, right? And not employees. So these are very often industry practices. I'm sorry, I don't have any sort of off the top of my head, any resource that I can recommend to you. But I certainly pick up the labor codes and read them. There are specific provisions relating to cine workers and artists. You can pick up the older laws that dealt with them, right? I am not sure if there is any express commentary around it, but it's a good area for you to research on.
Thank you, sir. And sir, I also want to request, like, can we get the PPTs that you taught us from? Because writing everything wasn't possible. So, are we getting the PPTs?
These PPTs are just the tip of the iceberg, honestly. This isn't study material. This is nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. So if you note the stuff down on the PPT, you are just scratching the surface.
No, sir, but like you need to know there's a tip of the iceberg to like further research the iceberg. Like if we can just get to know for that.
Sure, no problem. I'd be happy to share those, provided that these are not circulated widely, right? So long as you can keep it within the institution for your own internal reference, I'm more than happy to share it with the organizers. You can reach out to them for it.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for the classes, sir. That's great.
My pleasure.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
I clear without with all the concept which we have studied so far. So, but I have a small doubt regarding the independent contractor. So, sir, during the course of lecture, you have said one line. There are contracts which are of many years, which are there are a long period of time. So, for that, this become a very problematic because these contractors are not be regarded as an employee of the company. So, do you think that there are situations where the independent contractors are being exploited by the companies? Although we have a law about for safeguard their interests, but even we face their problem in the practical situations. I just wanted to ask that.
Yeah. So see the fact that this is the whole Uber argument, right? Who is an independent contractor? Who is an employee? Are Uber drivers independent contractors? Correct. That's the argument Uber is taking, and a lot of the other gig workers are taking. So there is certainly a risk of these types of arrangements being abused. And very often we do find the claims arising in this respect, including from the Labour Department, say that you're misclassifying employees as contractors simply to avoid paying them social security and other benefits, right? So, you know, I don't know if that answers your question. There is a risk that it could be abused, but at the end of the day, that risk exists with any law. The solution that they are trying to find for certain sections of such workers, such as platform workers, is to at least give them access to social security through the codes. And otherwise, you know, organizations will anyway be subject to potential claims, disputes, scrutiny from the authorities, which might help them sort of modulate and regulate their actions, right? I do not see organizations with nobody on their payroll and everyone, like several hundred or several thousand people, all acting as independent contractors, right? You don't see that, because you try and do something like that and you're certainly going to get caught. There are tax obligations, social security obligations, all of those which would get scrutinized, which can result in you getting caught if you try and attempt something like that.
So I agree with your point, but I just wanted to convey that I recently read a case regarding this, where the court said that because you are binded with the contract, so we can't help it out in that case because you are binded with the contract. So here, what can we do in that situation where the contract is against the employer independent contractor?
See, I mean, I don't know what the context or facts of those cases were. You know, each dispute has to be decided on merits. There are equally a lot number of cases where courts have looked through the arrangement and ultimately decided that somebody is called a contractor under the written agreement, but effectively is an employee, right? So I don't know if you can form a sort of opinion on this just by reading one case. There are lots of cases on this.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
So if you're done with questions, then I'd like to thank you all for being a very patient and participative and good audience. I appreciate the fact that you've taken time out to do this. As I started in the very beginning, my objective was to show to young lawyers such as yourself, right, that this is a very vibrant and dynamic field of law. It's one of the most upcoming fields of law in India, with huge potential, right, for people to find opportunities to do well and to grow. With other fields, there is sometimes too much supply and less demand. Employment law is an area where there is in fact significant amount of demand and very little good supply, right? So this is an area where I think anyone who has found any of the discussions over these last 3 days interesting, you should certainly focus on it and try and you know, build your knowledge and experience around it. You know, I know of a lot of institutions which organize moot courts on specific subject areas. I would encourage Symbiosis to try and do something on employment laws. We'd be happy to partner with you all to do it if that's possible, right? But it's a very challenging and interesting field. It's got a very human element to it. It's not just pure business and numbers, right? There is always a very significant human element to employment law, which is also one of the reasons why I like it so much. So my hope is that you know, I would have sort of inspired some of you to look at this as a serious and you know, good area of practice in the long run. You know, feel free to reach out via your administration, your alumni, your colleagues to us if you need any guidance. We'd be more than happy to do that. Right. So Thank you once again, and have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Atul, for devoting time for these three informative and the valuable session.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.